Zorath had been called many things throughout his career: the ghost of the void, the hunter, and the one name that struck fear into the hearts of the galaxy's deadliest criminals: the Silent Reaper. He was the deadliest assassin the galaxy had ever known, and his reputation preceded him. No one escaped his grasp, and no target ever survived. He was the perfect weapon, trained in every form of combat, ruthless and efficient. His contracts were always completed without a single mistake. So when Zorath walked into the dimly lit office of the Gala Syndicate, he felt no different than usual. He had completed countless jobs for them, and this new contract was just another routine kill. Or so he thought. The office was cold, its walls lined with high-tech equipment and holographic screens that flickered in the low light. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco and cheap cologne. At the far end of the room, a figure sat behind a desk, waiting. The figure, Syndicate leader Torv, looked up as Zorath entered. "You're late." Torv's voice was low and calm, but there was an edge to it. He was not used to being kept waiting, especially not by someone like Zorath. But Zorath didn't care. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, stepping toward the desk. "Who is the target?" Zorath asked, his voice cool, calm, and devoid of emotion. He had no need for pleasantries. The job was simple: eliminate the target, collect the payment, and move on. That was his world. Torv tapped a button on the desk, and a holographic display flickered to life, showing an image of a man, not a criminal, not a leader of a rival syndicate, but a human. Zorath's eyes narrowed. Humans weren't typically targets for someone of his caliber. They were weak, their systems fragile, their technology nowhere near the level of the galaxy's most dangerous species. Why would anyone pay for a human to be killed? "This is your target," Torv said, not noticing the slight tension that had appeared in Zorath's body. "His name is Aiden Cross. He's a human, a former soldier. He's been causing some problems. We need him eliminated, and we need it done cleanly." Zorath stared at the hologram, his mind racing. A former soldier, a human. He couldn't believe it. This job felt wrong, out of place. But a job was a job. And the Gala Syndicate paid well. "What's the catch?" Zorath finally asked, his voice steady. Torv smiled thinly. "There's no catch. He's located on a remote station in the Grand Nebula, a place where even the galaxy's most dangerous bounty hunters are reluctant to go. You'll find him there, and once you do, eliminate him. Simple, no complications." Zorath studied the image of Aiden for a moment longer. There was something about him that didn't sit right. His eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, seemed to carry a weight, a history. Zorath didn't trust it, but he had learned long ago not to question his contracts. They were always straightforward, until now. "Why is he here?" Zorath asked. "What does he want?" Torv leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's not your concern. Just do the job. The Syndicate will handle the rest." Zorath nodded, turning toward the door. The contract was as simple as it seemed. Find the human, kill him, and move on. Nothing more to it. He had no reason to doubt it. Humans weren't known for being a threat to someone like him. They were too soft, too predictable. The contract would be easy. As he walked down the hallway of the Syndicate's headquarters, Zorath's mind wandered for just a moment. A human, though. It was strange. He had never been tasked with hunting one before. There was a feeling in the pit of his stomach, something nagging at him, but he shrugged it off. It was just another job. He had killed countless beings, aliens, bounty hunters, soldiers, and even other assassins. What was one more? He arrived at his ship, the Revenant, and boarded. The engines hummed to life as Zorath initiated the jump sequence. He didn't need much information to track a target. His instincts, his training, and his vast knowledge of the galaxy's underworld were more than enough to lead him to Aiden Cross. The Grand Nebula was a treacherous place, filled with gas clouds and debris. But Zorath was used to navigating through dangerous territories. It didn't take long for his ship to enter the nebula, and as it did, the galaxy outside his viewport became a swirling mass of colors and chaos, a fitting place for the end of a life. As his ship hurtled deeper into the nebula, Zorath's thoughts began to drift. He thought about his past, the countless people he had killed, the faces that haunted him. For a moment, he thought about the feeling he had before leaving the syndicate's office, the strange sense that this job wasn't going to be like the others. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He was the deadliest assassin in the galaxy. No one could stop him. Certainly not a human. The coordinates on his screen blinked, signaling the location of Aiden Cross. The station loomed ahead, silent and dark, almost abandoned. Zorath felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. There was something wrong with this place, but again, he dismissed it. He was here to do one thing, and one thing only: kill. As the ship descended toward the station, Zorath had no idea that this contract, this simple, routine job, would become the last one he ever took. Zorath's boots hit the cold, metallic floor of the space station with a dull thud. The station was eerily quiet, far too quiet for his taste. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the walls of the hallway. His senses were on high alert, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Something about this station felt wrong, like it was alive in ways he couldn't explain. But Zorath didn't dwell on it. His target was close, and that was all that mattered. He glanced at the data pad in his hand. Aiden Cross. The man's last known location was marked just ahead, in a maintenance section deep within the station. Zorath's every step was measured, calculated. He had learned long ago that even a single misstep could be deadly. But as he moved down the narrow corridor, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The air felt thick, and his instincts, which had always been razor-sharp, were now tingling with a sense of something unnatural. The silence weighed on him, pressing down like a physical force. He paused, listening intently. A faint sound echoed through the halls, a soft scraping, almost like metal against metal. His hand instinctively moved to the blaster at his side. The sound stopped. He remained still, waiting. Nothing. He continued forward, his movements fluid, ghost-like. He reached a door at the end of the hallway. The signal led him here. His target was inside. As Zorath prepared to breach the door, he felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. It wasn't the cold of the station. It was something else. Something alive, something he couldn't put his finger on. But the assassin was not one to hesitate. He was here for a job, and he would finish it. With a swift movement, Zorath slid open the door and stepped into the room. The moment he entered, he knew something had changed. The air felt charged, as if the very atmosphere around him was brimming with tension. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. A single figure stood in the center of the room, facing him. Aiden Cross. The human didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised to see Zorath standing there. Instead, Aiden slowly turned to face him, his eyes meeting Zorath's with a calm intensity that almost made the assassin stop in his tracks. There was no fear in those eyes, only quiet confidence, as if this moment had been expected. Zorath's mind raced. This man was different, not like any target he'd ever faced. He didn't seem nervous, didn't seem like prey. The thought stirred something in Zorath, a flicker of uncertainty he rarely allowed himself to feel. Zorath, the Silent Reaper, I presume. Aiden's voice was low but firm, not shaken in the least. I've been expecting you. Zorath's hand tightened around the grip of his blaster. I'm here to finish a job. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Aiden smiled, a small, knowing smile. Harder. My dear assassin, this was never meant to be easy for you. Zorath's gaze narrowed. He'd never encountered a target that spoke to him this way. So calm, so unbothered. This was supposed to be a routine job. Kill the human, collect the payment, move on. But Aiden's demeanor was unsettling. There was no fear. There was no desperation. Nothing to suggest this man was about to die. "What do you want?" Zorath asked, his voice cold, professional. Aiden didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. Zorath instinctively took a step back, not because he was afraid, but because something about Aiden's presence felt off, unreal. "I don't want anything," Aiden finally said. "I'm here because I was sent here. To meet you." He paused, then added, "And I know what you're thinking, assassin. You're wondering why a human like me would be so calm in the face of death. You're wondering why I'm not running or pleading. You're wondering how I even know your name." Zorath's expression remained unchanged. This man was speaking nonsense. It didn't matter. Zorath had killed thousands of beings who had begged for mercy. Humans were no different. "I don't need answers. I need you dead," Zorath said, his voice tinged with frustration. But instead of fear, Aiden only chuckled. It wasn't mocking, just amused. It was as if he had seen something in Zorath that Zorath hadn't seen in himself. It was as if he knew Zorath wasn't the one in control. Before Zorath could respond, Aiden's movements blurred. In an instant, the human was upon him. It was like being struck by a force he couldn't comprehend. Aiden didn't attack in the typical human way. There was no wild flailing or desperate defense. No, Aiden's movements were controlled, precise, as though he had been trained to fight in ways Zorath had never seen. Zorath had always prided himself on being the fastest, the deadliest. But now, for the first time in his career, he was being outpaced. Aiden's attacks were fast, too fast for a mere human. Zorath's eyes widened as he barely blocked a series of strikes aimed at his chest. Aiden's speed was terrifying. Zorath staggered back, using his superior strength to push Aiden away. But the human's feet remained rooted like a stone pillar. It was impossible. No human should be capable of this kind of strength. Aiden stopped for a moment, his eyes locking onto Zorath's. And for the first time, Zorath saw nothing. No fear, no weakness, just a cold, calculating intelligence. "You were never meant to win, Zorath," Aiden said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zorath felt a sharp pang of realization, a sinking feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a simple kill. It wasn't just a contract. This was a test. And for the first time in his life, Zorath wasn't sure he was going to make it out alive. Zorath stood in the dimly lit room, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The fight had been unlike any he had ever encountered. Aiden Cross, the human, had moved with a grace and speed that defied all logic. Zorath had barely managed to hold his ground. Never had he faced a target who made him feel this vulnerable. He had faced enemies from all corners of the galaxy, some stronger, some faster, but none had ever made him feel this way. Aiden stood across from him, seemingly unfazed by the exchange. He was breathing lightly, almost as if he hadn't broken a sweat. Zorath's mind churned, struggling to understand what he was up against. Humans were weak, frail beings. At least, that's what he had been told. They didn't have the physical prowess of a Gortak or the natural instincts of an Exivian. They were supposed to be easy prey, just like every other target he had hunted before. But this one, Aiden Cross, was different. "What are you?" Zorath's voice broke through the silence, hoarse and filled with a mixture of confusion and growing frustration. Aiden's eyes, cold and unblinking, met his. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer. Zorath's instincts flared up again. But this time, they were more focused. He didn't know why, but he could feel it. Danger. He wasn't sure if it was the human or the station itself, but he felt like he was being cornered. The walls were closing in. "Do you really think I'm just some ordinary human?" Aiden's voice was calm, almost detached, as if he was speaking to someone who had no idea what they were really dealing with. Zoreth clenched his fists, his mind trying to make sense of the situation. He had been hired to eliminate a human, a soldier, as Torv had put it. But now, there was a deeper mystery here, one that Zoreth hadn't anticipated. Something was off. There was a power radiating from Aiden, an unsettling force that Zoreth couldn't explain. It was as if he was facing something beyond the ordinary. "I'm not just some soldier," Aiden continued, his eyes never leaving Zoreth. "And I'm not your typical human either." Zoreth's confusion grew, but he stayed silent. He wasn't the type to ask questions. In his line of work, you simply followed the orders. You didn't question the why. But this was different. Aiden took another step forward, his body language more relaxed now. He wasn't trying to intimidate Zoreth, but somehow it felt even more threatening. "You're probably wondering why you couldn't defeat me, why you couldn't anticipate my moves, right?" Aiden smiled slightly. "It's because I'm not a regular human. I'm not the weakling you thought I'd be. I'm a warborn." Zoreth's brow furrowed at the unfamiliar term. Warborn. What was that supposed to mean? "A warborn," Aiden repeated as if reading Zoreth's confusion. "Humans, when pushed to the brink, have a hidden potential. Something that awakens when we're faced with a fight we can't afford to lose. It's a power that makes us stronger, faster, more capable than anything you could have imagined." Zoreth took a step back, processing the words. This was something he had never encountered. A human with enhanced strength and speed. A human who wasn't bound by the typical limits of his species. But that didn't explain everything. If Aiden was a warborn, why was he on this station? Why was he being targeted? "Why are you here?" Zoreth asked, his voice low and threatening. He wasn't going to let Aiden control this conversation. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Aiden's gaze softened for the first time, as though he could see right through Zoreth. "I'm here because they made a mistake. They thought they could use me as a tool for their wars. They thought they could control me, control the warborn. But that's where they went wrong. No one controls me. Not anymore." Zoreth's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just talking about some personal vendetta. Aiden was speaking about something far more dangerous. Who had done this to him? Who had turned a human into this creature? Aiden's eyes turned hard again. "I'm not the only one, you know. There are others. More of us, scattered across the galaxy. And we've been waiting for the right time to fight back." Zoreth stood there, trying to process what he was hearing. A revolution. Humans who had been turned into something more, something deadly. Aiden wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a weapon, a force waiting to be unleashed. And Zoreth had been sent to kill him. But now, with this new information, he realized that this job wasn't as simple as he had thought. This was just the beginning. Aiden continued, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I knew you'd come for me, Zoreth. You're a tool of the Syndicate. You do their bidding, no questions asked. But you have to ask yourself, who do you really work for? The Syndicate or the Galaxy?" Zoreth took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had never been the type to question his employers. But now, as the weight of Aiden's words sank in, he felt a flicker of doubt. Who was the real enemy here? "You want me to join you?" Zoreth spat, his grip on his blaster tightening. He would never join forces with a human, no matter the circumstances. Aiden shook his head slowly. "I don't need your help, but you'll soon see. The galaxy is changing, Zoreth, and whether you like it or not, you'll be caught in the middle." For the first time, Zoreth felt like he was standing at the edge of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Zoreth stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process everything Aiden had just said. A war-born human, part of a larger rebellion. And now he was telling Zoreth he had been sent to kill him for a reason. But that reason wasn't clear, not yet. All he knew was that everything he had believed, everything he had thought he knew, was now in question. The room was heavy with tension. Aiden stood there, arms relaxed at his sides, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving Zorath. There was something almost too calm about him, something that made Zorath uneasy. He was no longer the predator in this situation. He was being hunted in a way he didn't fully understand. Zorath tightened his grip on his blaster, the metal handle cold against his palm. He was an assassin, trained, lethal, relentless. He had killed hundreds of targets across the galaxy, most of them in far more dangerous situations than this. And yet, in this room with Aiden Cross, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. "You think I'll just walk away from this?" Zorath finally spoke, his voice sharp and filled with defiance. "I've been paid for a job, Aiden. A job I will finish. I don't care who or what you are." Aiden tilted his head slightly, as though he was studying Zorath. His eyes were full of something Zorath couldn't read. Understanding. No, it wasn't that. It was almost pity. "You're so sure of yourself," Aiden said softly, his voice carrying a quiet power. "But you'll soon see. Your employer, the Syndicate, they've already lost. They just don't know it yet." The words hit Zorath like a punch to the gut. The Syndicate, they were a power, a faction that controlled countless worlds and operations across the galaxy. Their reach was vast, their influence unmatched, and yet Aiden was speaking of them as though they were a dying breed. Aiden stepped forward slowly, his boots making no sound on the floor. "Zorath, you're not a mindless killer. I can see it in your eyes. You have a purpose. You've killed, yes, but you've done it for a reason. The Syndicate may have hired you, but your conscience, your morals, are still intact." Zorath shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't have morals. I have a job to do. And I do it better than anyone else. That's all that matters." Aiden's expression softened, but only slightly. "Is that really all that matters? Just killing for the sake of killing?" Zorath's pulse quickened. This wasn't supposed to be a conversation. He was supposed to eliminate the target. But Aiden wasn't acting like any target he had ever faced. This was different. "I don't have time for your lectures," Zorath said, his voice hardening. He raised his blaster again. But this time, something inside him hesitated. He had always been confident, always sure. But now, as he stood in front of Aiden, he felt an unfamiliar feeling. A pull, a flicker of something deeper than his training. What was it? Aiden's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I'm not lecturing you, Zorath. I'm offering you a choice. The Syndicate has sent you to kill me. But now, they've drawn you into something much larger. There's a war coming, and you can choose to be a part of it. Or you can continue to do the bidding of those who only use you as a pawn." The word pawn hit Zorath harder than he expected. He had never thought of himself as a pawn. He was an assassin, a master of his craft. No one controlled him, not even the Syndicate. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. "Why should I trust you?" Zorath asked, his voice tight. "What makes you think I'd join a cause that isn't mine?" Aiden's eyes were intense now. "You don't have to trust me, Zorath. Trust yourself. This isn't just about me. This isn't just about the Syndicate. This is about the future of humanity. We are a force that can no longer be ignored. And when we fight back, there won't be any stopping us." Zorath's heart pounded in his chest. A rebellion of humans, war-born humans, who had been secretly preparing for a war of their own. A war that could topple the Syndicate. And with it, the balance of power in the galaxy. The thought of such an upheaval was both thrilling and terrifying. But Zorath wasn't a hero. He wasn't a rebel. He was an assassin. He was paid to kill, not to fight wars he had no stake in. "Don't make me laugh," Zorath said with a sneer. "I don't care about your revolution. I do what I do because it pays. That's the only truth in this galaxy." Aiden didn't flinch. He just kept watching Zorath, his gaze unwavering. "I understand," Aiden said quietly. You've been living in the shadows for so long, you've forgotten what it means to stand in the light. Zorath's mind was spinning. He couldn't deny the truth in Aiden's words. He had spent years in the shadows, following orders, living for the next kill. But was that all he was destined for? A tool for hire. You've always been in control of your destiny, Zorath, Aiden continued, his voice steady. But now you have a choice, a chance to fight for something bigger than yourself. You can kill me, walk away, and continue as you always have. Or you can join us, and together, we can reshape the galaxy. Zorath's mind raced as he looked at Aiden. Everything was changing. The world he had known, the rules he had followed, they were all crumbling before his eyes. A war was coming, and no matter what he chose, his life would never be the same again. He had a choice now, a choice that would define the rest of his life. The question was, which path would he take? Zorath stood at the crossroads of his life, staring into the depths of the unknown. Aiden Cross had laid out his offer, a choice that could change everything for him. The rebellion, the warborn, the war against the syndicate, all of it was overwhelming. Zorath had always known one thing, his job. He was an assassin, plain and simple. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt a tension he couldn't shake off, a sense of being pulled in two directions. Aiden's words echoed in his mind. You can kill me, walk away, and continue as you always have. Or you can join us, and together, we can reshape the galaxy. Zorath clenched his fists. The thought of joining the humans, even those enhanced warborn, felt like an impossible betrayal to everything he had ever stood for. He had been raised to kill, to be an instrument of death, never to fight for a cause. But Aiden wasn't just some human. There was power in his eyes, a truth in his words that Zorath couldn't ignore. Aiden seemed to sense Zorath's hesitation. You don't have to decide right now, he said, his voice softening. I'm not asking you to jump into something you don't understand. But think about it. You know what the Syndicate is capable of. You've seen it firsthand. They use people like you and me to further their own goals. They don't care about you, Zorath. They never have. Zorath's jaw tightened. He had always known that. The Syndicate didn't care about its soldiers, its assassins. They were tools, nothing more. But he had never cared. He did the job. He got paid. That was the way the galaxy worked. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. You're not like them, Aiden said, his voice steady. You don't belong in the shadows, Zorath. You were made for something more. The words hit harder than Zorath expected. Made for something more. It felt like a challenge, one he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. But as he stood there, staring at Aiden, something inside him stirred, a spark he hadn't felt in years. Was it hope? Was it the idea of fighting for something greater than himself? Or was it simply the lure of revenge, the idea of striking back at those who had used him? Aiden crossed the room, his movements fluid, and stopped just in front of Zorath. He didn't raise a weapon, didn't make any aggressive gestures. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering. You know what the Syndicate has done. You know the pain they've caused, not just to you, but to countless others across the galaxy. The Warborn, we're fighting for a future where they don't control everything, where people like you don't have to be pawns in their game. Zorath felt a pang in his chest. Pawns. It was a word he had never thought of himself as, but now it seemed to fit. He had been just another weapon in a never-ending war, fighting for whoever paid him, never questioning why or for whom. But Aiden was offering him a chance to change that, to fight for something real, something worth fighting for. I can't just forget everything I've done, Zorath said, his voice quieter now, the words feeling heavier than he had expected. I've killed people, destroyed lives. I can't just walk away from that. Aiden's expression softened. No one is asking you to forget your past. We all have blood on our hands, but we can choose to fight for something better, to make a difference. And in the end, that's what matters. Zorath took a step back, his mind spinning. The weight of his past, the weight of the countless lives he had ended, seemed to press in on him. It was like a suffocating blanket, threatening to crush him. He had been living for so long in the darkness, doing the things that were required of him without ever questioning the why. But now, that darkness felt empty. "You can't keep running, Zoreth," Aiden continued, his voice low but firm. "You've reached the end of the road. You have two choices now. Continue being a weapon for the Syndicate, or stand with us. Fight for a future that isn't controlled by people like them." Zoreth's thoughts raced. What if Aiden was right? What if there was something more to life than killing? Could he really change? Could he be something other than just an assassin? The room felt like it was closing in on him. Every decision he made from here on out would shape his future. If he walked away now, he would never know what could have been. But if he stayed, if he chose to fight, there was no turning back. He would be a part of something bigger than himself, something that might cost him everything. "I need time to think," Zoreth finally said, his voice hoarse. He turned away, unable to look at Aiden any longer. He couldn't face the decision yet. It was too much, too overwhelming. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just a job. This was a war, and he was caught in the middle of it. Aiden didn't stop him. He didn't try to convince him further. He simply nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, Zoreth. But remember, you won't have forever." As Zoreth walked away, the weight of the choice pressed down on him. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep living in the shadows forever. A new path lay before him, one that could either lead to redemption or destruction. He only hoped he was strong enough to walk it. Zoreth sat in the dimly lit room, his fingers drumming on the cold metal table in front of him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. The decision weighed heavily on him, and despite the time he had spent thinking, the answer wasn't coming any clearer. He could still hear Aiden's voice in his head, urging him to join the fight against the Syndicate. But the job he had been hired for kept echoing in his mind too. The mission to kill Aiden Cross. The door slid open with a soft hiss, breaking his thoughts. He looked up, expecting to see one of the few people he trusted, someone who would provide clarity, perhaps even guidance. Instead, the figure who entered was familiar, but not in the way he had hoped. It was Cashin, one of the Syndicate's most ruthless operatives, and a former ally of Zoreth's. "You're making a mistake, Zoreth," Cashin said, his voice cold, his tone unmistakably commanding. He crossed the room, his black leather coat swishing with each step. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Zoreth, who instinctively reached for his blaster. But he didn't draw it. Not yet. Zoreth didn't respond right away, his eyes studying Cashin. The man was an old friend, someone he had fought beside in countless operations, someone Zoreth had trusted. But trust had always been a currency he dealt with carefully. Cashin had never been known for loyalty. "You've got two choices, my friend," Cashin continued, his gaze hardening. "You can forget about all this nonsense with the Warborn and the Rebellion. You can come back to the Syndicate. We've got a job for you. A real one. Not these games." Zoreth's grip on his blaster tightened. "You don't get it, Cashin. I'm not going back to the Syndicate. Not after everything they've done. Not after what they've done to me." Cashin chuckled darkly. "You think the Syndicate cares about you, Zoreth. You were always just another tool to them, just like the rest of us. You think the Warborn are any different. They're just another faction looking to play the game. They don't care about you either. You're being played." The words stung, and Zoreth's fist clenched. There was truth in them, but there was something more that nagged at him. Was Cashin right? Was he really just a pawn in a bigger game, no matter which side he chose? Cashin's eyes flickered to the blaster at Zoreth's side, his expression turning almost pitying. "I know you, Zoreth. I know the kind of man you are. And I know you don't want to be some hero in a war you don't understand. But I can promise you this. The syndicate will always be there. They'll never turn on you. They know how to use people like us. Zorath could feel the temptation in Cashin's words, the pull to return to what was familiar, to the cold, predictable world of the syndicate. But that path felt more like a trap than a choice. There was no future there, not anymore. "You're wrong," Zorath finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "The syndicate doesn't get to control me anymore. I've seen too much. I know what they're capable of. What they've done. You've seen it too." Cashin took a step forward, his eyes darkening. "I've seen the truth, Zorath. And the truth is, you don't belong with the Warborn. They'll betray you just like they've betrayed everyone else. They've made promises they can't keep, and when it comes down to it, they'll turn on you. The only real loyalty left is with the syndicate." Zorath stood up from the table, his body tense with anger. "I've heard enough, Cashin. You've been a tool of the syndicate for too long to see what's really at stake. You can stay with them if you want, but don't try to drag me back." For a moment, the two men locked eyes. It was a battle of wills, an unspoken understanding between them. They had fought together, killed together, and survived together. But now, they were on opposite sides. Cashin's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this, Zorath. The syndicate doesn't take kindly to betrayal. And if you think the Warborn will protect you, you're more naive than I thought." Zorath felt the weight of Cashin's words, but they didn't shake him. He was done being controlled, done being the weapon for hire. His life was his own now, no matter how dangerous the road ahead might be. Cashin's eyes flashed with anger as he turned to leave. "You'll see. Everyone always does." As the door slid shut behind him, Zorath exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He had made his choice. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be consequences, and the syndicate was a dangerous enemy. But he knew one thing for certain now. He wasn't going back. The Warborn were his future, and even if it meant facing the wrath of the syndicate, he would stand with them. He was done with shadows, done with being a pawn. The betrayal, the choice, the path ahead, all of it had become clear. Zorath stood on the balcony of his quarters, looking out at the barren world below. The darkened skies reflected his own turbulent thoughts. It had been days since Cashin's visit, but the weight of his warning still lingered in Zorath's mind. The syndicate had always been ruthless, but now it felt like they were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The Warborn were preparing for an assault, a battle that could change everything. Aiden had briefed him on the next phase of their operation, one that would finally give them a fighting chance against the syndicate's stranglehold on the galaxy. But Zorath couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, like a predator waiting to strike. "Zorath." The voice came from behind him. Zorath turned to see Aiden Cross enter, his expression as serious as ever. He didn't need to say it. Zorath could feel the tension in the air. "It's happening," Aiden said, his voice low. "The syndicate has made their move. We've got less than 24 hours before they launch an all-out assault on our position." Zorath didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. The syndicate was never one to let a betrayal slide. They would come for him, for them, and they would come hard. "Do you think they'll go as far as to target me personally?" Zorath asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of seriousness. He had no illusions about the syndicate's methods. They didn't just eliminate targets. They made examples of them. Aiden nodded. "They'll stop at nothing. They'll want to make sure you're dead, Zorath. The syndicate doesn't forgive those who betray them. Not after everything you've done." Zorath felt the familiar twinge of regret for the years he had spent working for them, for the blood on his hands. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. "Then we prepare," Zorath said, his voice hardening. "I didn't come this far just to lie down and die." Aiden gave a brief nod. "We'll be ready. The Warborn are ready to fight, and we'll make sure you're not the only one they come for." Zorath turned back to the balcony, staring out into the distance. The Syndicate was coming, and they were bringing the full force of their empire with them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about making sure the Syndicate understood one thing: you can't control Zorath any longer. The sound of boots on the floor caught his attention. Aiden was already on his way out, preparing for the battle ahead. Zorath watched him go, his mind already working through the plan. He knew that this war would cost lives. He had always known it. But it felt different now. There was something personal in this fight. It wasn't just about the galaxy or the Warborn. It was about him, his future, his redemption. Zorath turned and walked toward his weapons cache, pulling out his weapons with the ease of someone who had spent years wielding them. He checked his blasters, made sure his combat knives were securely fastened to his belt, and examined the energy packs that would keep him in the fight. As he strapped the last piece of equipment on, he paused, looking at his reflection in the polished metal of the wall. He didn't recognize the man looking back at him. The face was the same, but the eyes, they had changed. They were no longer the cold, emotionless eyes of an assassin. They were the eyes of someone who had something to fight for, someone who had finally chosen a side. The door slid open again, and Aiden stepped inside. This time, he wasn't alone. A small group of Warborn soldiers had gathered outside, waiting for orders. Zorath could feel the urgency in their presence. The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just another job. This was the start of something bigger. And Zorath was right in the center of it. "You ready?" Aiden asked, his voice steady. Zorath gave a brief nod, his eyes hard. "Let's do this." As they moved toward the war room, Zorath couldn't shake the feeling that the Syndicate had already made their first move. But he didn't let fear take hold. Instead, he steeled himself for the battle ahead. The Syndicate's wrath would come for them. But they weren't ready for what Zorath and the Warborn had in store. He had made his choice. He was no longer a weapon of the Syndicate, no longer a pawn in their game. He was a soldier now, and he was ready to fight.